I've got to get this off my chest. The situation at work is a mess, and it's pushing me over the edge. Honestly, it's starting to feel like I'm losing my mind over this. My name's Chelsea. I'm 24, and I've been stuck in this for almost a year, with each day somehow worse than the last. About a year ago, we brought on a new hire named Dan. From day one, something about him didn't sit right. I mean, seriously, something was off. He's 27. On paper, he looks normal, but his behavior around women is just odd. And to be straight with you, it's really getting under my skin. In those first weeks, we did what you do with any newcomer. We tried to make him feel welcome. It was me and the other women on the team. Megan sits 2 desks over, and Sarah's in the cubicle right behind me. We pulled him into chats, invited him to lunch, asked about his weekend, just regular office small talk, but he'd toss back a couple of clipped answers, then pivot to his screen like we weren't even there. At first, we figured he was shy or still settling in, but it didn't take long to see that wasn't it. What really got to me was how he shut things down any time a woman steered the talk away from strictly work-related stuff. I'd ask if he had weekend plans. He'd mumble, "Not really," then bury himself in the keyboard or a stack of papers. Yet with the guys, he'd chat about sports or movies for 20 minutes straight. It was obvious and, honestly, pretty rude. The last straw for me came when I asked him to join our usual lunch group. We always hit this little spot down the street. It's a fun break, and he said, "Thanks, but I've got other plans," without even looking up from his desk. A few hours later, I saw him laughing with Jake and Marcus from accounting like they were old friends. He seemed like a completely different person. Between you and me, it started feeling personal pretty fast. I usually get along with people, and I can't remember anyone blanking me that hard. Megan picked up on it too. Sarah was frustrated as well. She tried more than once to start a conversation, and he'd hit her with a one-word reply and walk off. We kept comparing notes because the whole thing was so bizarre. What made it stranger was watching how relaxed and friendly he was with the guys. He jumped into their random chats, laughed at their jokes, and even joined their little office fantasy football league. With us, there was nothing, just a stiff "good morning" and a flat "have a good evening," and even those felt forced. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt for a while, thinking maybe he was awkward around women or dealing with some kind of social anxiety. But the more I watched him with everyone else, the clearer it got that this was a choice. He was deciding not to be friendly with the women while being totally normal and talkative with the guys. Sarah was the first to say out loud what we were all thinking, that his behavior was creating a weird, uncomfortable vibe where the women felt shut out and unwanted. Why should we have to tiptoe around him when he's clearly capable of basic human interaction? It didn't add up, and it started to get under my skin more than I expected. The more we compared notes, the more frustrated we got. We were doing our best to be welcoming and inclusive, and he kept shutting us down while acting buddy-buddy with every man in the room. It felt wrong and unfair, and it started to poison how I felt about coming to work each day. Something had to give, and I was done pretending his behavior was okay when it obviously wasn't. After that, I started watching Dan's patterns a lot more closely. What I noticed made everything worse. I'm not usually the type to study someone's every move, but his behavior was so obviously off that I wanted to understand what was really going on. Once I started paying attention, the signs were everywhere. Every morning he'd walk in, toss a general "good morning" to the room, and then head straight into conversations with whatever guys were nearby. He'd ask Jake about his weekend, crack jokes with Marcus about some TV show they both watched, even chat with our supervisor about nothing in particular for 10 or 15 minutes. But the second any of us women tried to join those chats or start our own, he snapped into all business mode. It was like watching someone flip a switch. I began writing down specific moments because I honestly couldn't believe how blatant it had become. One time, for example, Megan mentioned she was having car trouble and was stressed about getting it fixed. Dan was standing right there and still didn't offer help or even acknowledge what Megan said. Later that same day, when Marcus mentioned his car was making a weird noise, Dan spent a solid 20 minutes walking him through possible fixes and even offered to take a look himself. 20 minutes for a guy he'd known less than a year, and nothing at all for a woman asking about the exact same problem. The lunch stuff was just as bad. We'd see him eat alone sometimes, or tag along with the guys when they went out, but he never once accepted an invite from any of us. Sarah asked him to join our group at least 6 times. Every time he had a reason he couldn't, and then he'd grab coffee with the guys, or hit their after-work drinks like it was no big deal. It was obvious he was avoiding us on purpose, and it started to feel personal and pretty hurtful. What really got under my skin was how much his whole personality shifted depending on who he was talking to. With the guys, he was loose and funny and totally normal. He cracked jokes, told stories about his life, even complained about traffic or his apartment like any regular person. With us, it was all, yes ma'am, no ma'am, and these stiff, formal replies that made every exchange awkward. Megan pointed out that he never asked any of us a single personal question either. He'd ask the guys about their hobbies, their families, their weekend plans, but with us, there was zero curiosity about our lives outside work. It felt like he saw the women as robots who powered on at 9 and off at 5, while the men were real people worth knowing. The breaking point came during a team meeting where everyone had to share something interesting about themselves. Dan leaned in with the men, asked follow-ups, connected it to his own experiences, even laughed at their stories. When it was my turn to talk about a hiking trip I did over the weekend, he just nodded politely and didn't say a word. Same thing happened when Sarah talked about her photography and when Megan mentioned her volunteer work. Just quiet nods and silence. After that meeting, the 3 of us grabbed coffee and really laid it out. We agreed it wasn't just weird anymore. It felt like a hostile environment, like we were being pushed to the edges in our own workplace. Sarah said she'd never dealt with anything like it. Megan admitted she was starting to dread coming in because being around him felt awkward and uncomfortable. That hit me, and I realized what bothered me most was how unfair the whole thing was. We were trying to be friendly and inclusive, actually trying to make the office a good place for everyone. And he kept shutting us down while giving the men his normal, social side. It honestly felt discriminatory. I was done pretending it wasn't affecting all of us. Something had to change with Dan's behavior, and it was clear that just being patient and understanding wasn't moving the needle. Things escalated when I decided I needed to really figure out what was going on, because his behavior had gotten too bizarre to ignore. I'm not the type to fixate on coworkers, but this was coloring my whole work experience, and I felt like I had every right to understand what his deal was. So I started paying closer attention, and what I found honestly shocked me. First, I looked at his social media, thinking I'd see if he was just antisocial by nature, or if it was specifically about women. His Facebook and Instagram showed a completely different person. Social, outgoing, hanging out with mixed groups, posting photos from parties and get-togethers with both men and women. So clearly, he was capable of normal interaction with women outside the office, which made how he acted at work even more confusing and, frankly, more insulting. After that, I began timing my breaks and lunches to line up with his, just to watch how he interacted across the day. The pattern was ridiculously consistent. Warm and engaged with the guys, cold and strictly professional with the women. I watched him spend 45 minutes helping Jake troubleshoot a computer issue, joking around the whole time like they were old pals. Then Sarah asked one simple question about a project they were both on, and he gave her a 2-sentence reply and walked away. The more I watched, the more examples piled up, and I started writing things down because the pattern was so obvious and so troubling. In group conversations, he'd join in, sure, but he'd aim almost every comment and every question at the men. He'd jump in to help the guys with projects or problems, but he never offered a hand to any of us, even when it was obvious we were stuck. He'd laugh at their jokes, then meet our attempts at humor with polite silence. When I shared what I was noticing, Megan and Sarah backed me up and started watching more closely too. That's when we realized he'd been added to the guys' group chat where they talk sports and plan after-work hangouts, while none of the women had ever been invited to anything like that. He was basically building a separate social circle that cut out every woman on the team, and he acted like that was completely normal. What drove me nuts was how few people seemed to notice or care. The men were fine with Dan because he treated them well, so they didn't see a problem. Even our supervisor missed the fact that Dan had created a two-tier setup. Men got his friendship and easy conversation. Women got the bare minimum of professional courtesy. Sarah suggested we start documenting specific incidents because what we were experiencing might actually cross a policy line. So we began logging dates and times whenever the difference was obvious, like when he offered to cover Jake's shift during a family emergency. But 2 weeks later, when Megan had almost the same situation, he didn't say a word, or the day he brought in homemade cookies for the guys and never offered any to the women. I also asked a few careful questions around the office to see what he was like with the men outside work. Turns out he was totally normal, funny, open, and easygoing. Marcus said Dan talked about his family, his hobbies, even a few dating stories. Meanwhile, none of us women knew a single thing about his personal life because he refused to share even the basics with us. At that point, the pattern felt undeniable. Dan was deliberately treating the women in our office differently than the men. It was creating a hostile environment where we felt excluded and devalued. We all do the same job and deserve the same basic courtesy and human interaction, but Dan had decided only the male employees were worth treating like real people. By this point, I was sure Dan's behavior crossed the line into workplace discrimination, and I was done sitting on my hands hoping it would magically fix itself. The three of us agreed it was time to act and file a formal complaint. What was happening wasn't fair, and we shouldn't have to swallow it just to keep our jobs. The day I decided to go to HR honestly felt like the first real relief I'd had in months, because I was finally doing something concrete about his behavior instead of grinding through it day after day. I'd hit my breaking point the week before, after a lunch invite situation that was so obviously biased I couldn't look the other way anymore. Jake and Marcus were putting together a lunch to celebrate a big project and invited the whole department. When they asked Dan if he was in, he said yes right away, and even joked that he'd been wanting to try that restaurant for months. But the second we got into scheduling details, and Sarah mentioned she might need to shift a couple meetings, Dan suddenly backed off and said he couldn't make it because of other commitments. It felt painfully clear he didn't want to go if women were going to be there, and honestly, it was humiliating. That same week, I watched him accept an after-work drinks invite from the guys, laughing about how he needed to unwind after a stressful day. But when Megan casually said a group of us were checking out a new happy hour spot, and he should come, he hit her with a cold, "Thanks, but I have plans," without even lifting his eyes from the screen. The double standard was so blatant and insulting that I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was normal, so I booked a meeting with HR and asked Megan and Sarah to join me so they could share what they'd seen too. The night before, I organized everything I'd been documenting, dates, times, and examples where his different treatment was crystal clear, notes on how it was affecting our day-to-day environment, and proof that he was perfectly capable of normal social interaction, but was choosing not to extend that basic courtesy to the women on our team. The HR meeting went exactly the way I hoped. The rep, Lisa, took us seriously from the jump and asked detailed questions about Dan's patterns. She focused in when we explained how his selective socializing created an atmosphere where women felt excluded and undervalued next to our male coworkers. When I laid out my incident log, she said it was obvious there was something here that needed a formal look. Lisa explained that what we were describing could amount to gender-based discrimination, and that maintaining different standards of treatment for men and women is exactly the kind of issue the company treats very seriously. Lisa assured us they'd run a full investigation and talk to other employees so they could see the whole picture. Hearing her say our experiences were real workplace issues, not us being too sensitive, like I'd started to fear, made me feel seen. The best part was when she said she'd speak to Dan directly about his behavior and make it crystal clear that everyone deserves the same courtesy and respect, no matter their gender. She added that if the findings backed up our complaint, there would be consequences for Dan and requirements to change how he acts going forward. For the first time in months, it felt like someone in charge understood this wasn't acceptable. I walked out of that meeting, feeling relieved and, honestly, a little powerful. For months I'd felt frustrated and helpless about the way Dan treated us, and now I'd finally taken a concrete step instead of just enduring it. Megan and Sarah thanked me for kicking off the complaint, and we all agreed we'd done the right thing by speaking up instead of staying quiet. I'll admit, part of me was curious to see how Dan would handle it once HR confronted him. In my head, he'd either apologize and start showing basic decency, or he'd get defensive and show his true colors, which would only strengthen our case. Either way, I was confident the investigation would vindicate us and push him to stop treating the women on our team differently. That confidence crashed when HR called me back for what I assumed would be a follow-up to discuss his consequences. Instead, I sat down in the conference room and got hit with news that blindsided me and made me question everything I thought I understood. Lisa opened by saying the investigation was complete and that they'd spoken with Dan about our complaint. But rather than outlining his punishment or a list of required changes, she shifted to his side of the story, his context for how he interacts at work. My stomach dropped. I could feel where this might be going, but I still wasn't ready for what came next. According to Lisa, Dan told HR he keeps strict professional boundaries with female coworkers because of something that happened at his last job. Casual friendships with women there turned into harassment accusations against him. He said he was falsely accused by a coworker who misread friendly conversations as romantic interest, and the fallout nearly wrecked his career and reputation. So now, he follows what he calls a professional courtesy-only policy with women at work to protect himself from that kind of misunderstanding ever again. I was floored. Lisa sat there laying it out like his story somehow excused everything, as if what happened to him before gave him permission to treat every woman at work like a risk who didn't deserve basic small talk. I pushed back and said that whatever his reasons, the way he treats women is still creating a hostile environment for us. She kept coming back to his legal right to keep professional boundaries, not the fact that those boundaries were landing on the women in our department like a wall. Then came the gut punch. She said several of the guys had backed him up. Jake, Marcus, even our supervisor told HR that Dan had already shared his past experience with them and that they understood and supported his decision to keep things strictly professional with female co-workers. I felt flat out betrayed. I thought those guys were friends, and when it mattered, they lined up behind Dan and acted like his double standard was perfectly reasonable. That's when Lisa dropped the real bomb. During the interviews, people had raised concerns about me, Megan, and Sarah, about how we'd been watching Dan, syncing our breaks to track his interactions, and talking about him all the time. Some coworkers called our behavior obsessive and uncomfortable. A few even complained that we were stirring up drama and making them feel awkward about their own conversations with him. I just stared at her. How did we go from reporting discrimination to being accused of harassment? Lisa explained that systematically monitoring a coworker, logging their social interactions, and fueling a tense atmosphere through constant discussion can count as harassment under company policy. She said our feelings were valid, but our response crossed lines and made others uncomfortable. The meeting ended with the decision I never saw coming: no action against Dan. According to HR, his behavior might be unfriendly, but it didn't violate policy and was within his rights as an employee. Me, Megan, and Sarah, on the other hand, would have to attend mandatory sensitivity training on appropriate workplace conduct and professional boundaries. They'd also keep an eye on things to make sure there were no more incidents of harassment or hostile behavior. I walked out, feeling humiliated and completely spun around. How did a situation where we were the ones being iced out turn into us being the problem? I still believe what Dan's doing is wrong and unfair, but apparently the company doesn't see it that way. It was the most frustrating, invalidating experience I've ever had at a job, and I had no clue how to process it. The days after that HR meeting were honestly the most humiliating, gutting stretch of my whole career, and I'm still trying to understand how everything went so wrong when all I was doing was trying to address what felt like real discrimination. What followed was like watching my professional life collapse in slow motion, and the worst part was how many people acted like I'd brought it on myself. Within a week of our sensitivity training, the whole office somehow knew about the investigation and how it ended. I never learned who leaked it, but suddenly everyone knew that I, Megan, and Sarah had reported Dan, and that HR decided we were the ones crossing lines. The look started, awkward, judging, and sometimes flat-out hostile, like I'd turned into the toxic coworker who stirs up drama and makes life harder for everyone. The social dynamics flipped against us overnight. People who used to include us in lunches and small talk began keeping their distance, like they were afraid we'd start tallying their interactions and complain about them too. To make it sting even more, I watched several coworkers go out of their way to be extra friendly and welcoming to Dan, almost to prove our complaints were unreasonable. Seeing him treated like a victim who needed protection from us made my blood boil. On top of that, my friendships with Megan and Sarah started cracking, which hurt most of all because I thought we were united in this. Sarah turned first, saying I'd pressured her into filing and that she never really believed Dan's behavior was that serious. She said she went along because she didn't want to argue with me, and now she blamed me for the fallout. Megan held on longer, but eventually started hinting that maybe we misread the situation and should have just accepted his professional boundaries instead of making such a big deal. Then came the final punch. Dan was offered a promotion to another department, effective immediately. HR called it a lateral move that would help his career development, but it was obvious they were rewarding him for handling things professionally and moving him away from what they now saw as our toxic influence. Meanwhile, I ended up with a formal reprimand in my file that would drag down my reviews and any shot at future promotions. He got advancement and validation. I got labeled a troublemaker who can't manage normal workplace interactions. And the worst part, I started living with the same kind of isolation I'd accused him of creating. Conversations would stop the moment I walked up. Lunch plans somehow went out without my name on them, and the whole place took on this polite but distant vibe whenever people had to deal with me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one eating alone now, the one feeling shut out of the office social loop. But unlike Dan's situation, mine was clearly tied to my own choices and bad judgment, and that stung even more. My work started to slip because I was so distracted and worn down by all of it. I'd spend half the day replaying how unfair it felt and trying to figure out how to fix my reputation instead of actually doing my job. My supervisor began making little remarks about my attitude and productivity, which only cranked up my stress and made it hit me that my spot here might not be safe long term. What I still can't fully wrap my head around is how I ended up as the villain when I truly thought I was calling out real discrimination. Dan is still keeping those strict professional boundaries with the women, and now everyone acts like that's totally reasonable. Meanwhile, I'm stuck with the label of someone who stirs up drama and can't handle normal working relationships. I've basically turned into a cautionary tale about misreading office dynamics and letting personal feelings steer professional decisions. I'll be honest, I still think there was something unfair about the way he treated us compared to the guys. But looking back, Maybe I should have accepted that some people choose to keep work relationships strictly professional and left it at that. At the time, it felt personal and biased, and I couldn't just let it slide. Now I'm living with the fallout every single day, and I don't know if my career fully recovers from this. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.